Hey Laura, is that you under Engage Office?
Yep, it's me.
Okay. I'm not quite sure who to let in, so I can go ahead and make you co-host because I see a Kirk and Marcia in the waiting room, but I don't know if there are speakers or not. I assume Kirk is.
Kirk, yep, he's the exec, so you can let him in. And Marcia,
Marcia Barnes, yes.
yep, you can let her in. The speaker is Chloe Akers,
Okay.
and the lobbyist is Garrett Johnson.
Okay. I'll look for those two and then I'll let Kirk and Marcia in right now. And I just made you co-host also.
Okay.
Huh? Ooh,
Hello, we're making progress.
I guess having the light above my head isn't the most flattering, but I'm not going to be on camera, so it doesn't matter. So, Marcia, your lips are going, but you're on mute.
You can't read lips. I figured we'd all learn to read
I
lips
can,
by
but
now.
I can't say in mixed company what your lips were saying.
I'm sorry. Okay.
Was that you pushing
No.
buttons?
Yeah. No, I mean I can share. So hopefully she'll be able to share. Right? Is Laura on here?
Yes, I am.
So she's going to have the capability. In other words, no one's designated as a host.
Well, I have Sarah on with me. She's your other TNA staff member that's muted right now, just so you know there's two of us that are
thank you.
monitoring. Yeah.
Hello.
Thank you, Sarah.
Of course.
So we wanted to have Marcia, we wanted to have you and Garrett and Chloe try to join a few minutes early. The way this works is you can share, right? And you can advance slides. And then when Chloe wants to share, you need to stop sharing and then she would be able to share. Yeah.
Okay.
Because you can't have two people sharing at the same time. Okay.
Makes sense.
So we'll want to test that when Chloe is able to join us. Oh, I see Garrett's in the waiting room. We'll get him entered in here.
And then Laura, I made you the host. If you want to make me the co-host, I can also monitor who's in the waiting room.
Okay.
Oh, you're looking good, Garrett.
Oh, wow.
Got dressed up. Are you?
You look nice and official.
Well, yeah.
It looks like there's a gym behind you.
So funny enough, I'm sharing some space with a couple other lobbyists down here downtown. And I'm actually like in a little closet, really, just kind of a quiet little nook. One of the guys that I share the space with, he's using the actual office space we have for another Zoom he's got going on. So
oh wow.
So here I am.
Cool.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining us. I wasn't sure that you were going to be able to, but I guess since committee was canceled, it was pushed to. Yeah.
I've been trying to make heads or tails of kind of the full practice stuff that we kind of got dropped on us, an hour or so ago.
Absolutely.
I've reached out to a couple people. No, Kirk, I told like I texted you, I reached out to Reeves' office and said, what's going on.
I just sent you a text. Lundberg's gone rogue.
Well, yeah, and then I called Jack Johnson's chief of staff, Luke, and said, "Hey man, do you know what's going on?" He goes, "I have no idea." And he looked up the bill. He goes, why is this thing even referred to Senate Commerce Committee? This thing needs to be in Senate Health Committee. He goes, you
It's
need to
all,
get
Just froze, Garrett.
it's
Or is it just me?
always, it's you. It's always been in Senate Commerce. That's where
Really?
it was heard. Mhm.
Okay. Well, I don't know what I was looking at the committee makeup. I don't know which ones. Well, I guess A, we need to figure out what the hell's going on with the language.
Right.
And B, I don't know
Absolutely.
which committee makeup's more beneficial to us depending on what it looks like. You know, if you look at Senate Health, you've got working group members that consist of Reeves and Massey and Swan and Hensley.
Yeah.
But then if you look at Commerce, you've got Swan on there again, Reeves on there again, Jack Johnson is on there, Akbari is on there. She was in the working group.
Right. Then she's a no.
Yeah, she's
Is
a
Paul
hard no.
Bailey, is Paul
So-
Bailey still chairing it?
Bailey, and then Bailey is the chair.
Of Commerce.
Yeah.
Commerce. Yeah. So I don't know.
Yeah,
Same
see,
group we
that's-
had last year.
That's right. That's
Is
the
Bo
only
Watson on
committee.
it?
Bo Watson, yes.
Yes.
Bo Watson is on both of those. So yeah, A, we need to figure out what the language says, and then how we need to react to it.
Yeah.
'Cause it could,
Well, question, Garrett,
Yeah.
as to whether it goes to Senate Commerce or Senate, who makes that decision?
the clerk's office, but a lot of input from the chairman and leadership.
Okay.
So
Okay.
if we needed to get it re-referred to maybe the health committee, if we think that would be better, then I would just talk to Bailey's research analyst and say, hey, listen, this bill really should be going to health. What can you help me out and just see? But I don't know if we want to go that route.
What happened, not last year, but the year before, is Senate Health kicked it to Commerce.
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
They
yeah.
did not want any part of it, so they kicked it to Commerce, which
And
kind
I-
of makes sense, sort of, because
Yeah.
part of it is all about choice,
Choice,
and the
competition,
economics of it.
the economics of it. Yeah.
Well, but on its face, it's a health.
Yes, it is.
Yes,
You know,
it is.
so-
It
but-
is.
I want us, obviously want us to go in whichever committee we have the best chance of getting something passed.
Exactly.
If it's
Right.
something that we even want to pursue.
Pursue. Well, I mean, I don't know. It's
Well, and I'll tell you another thing, and I think of all the bad scenarios in my head, but keep in mind, the TMA's Day on the Hill is next Tuesday. And so
Uh-huh.
there's going to be a ton of doctors up here walking the halls Tuesday. And if that bill gets heard in Commerce, that's on Tuesday. So if TMA does not like what this language might say,
TNA's not gonna like it.
they're not
Well,
going to
No
like
matter
it.
what it says,
then
Garrett.
Yeah.
they're going to have, there's going to be a huge contingent of doctors up here next Tuesday for their Day on the Hill. So they will actively be lobbying against that bill. Now, if it happens to go to health, then health is Wednesday, which is our Day on the Hill.
Right.
So, just
We
keep that in
may
the back of your
we
mind.
may be lobbying against this bill as well.
we could, yeah,
I mean, we don't know.
yeah.
Well,
So,
we have to be very, very careful about lobbying against it, or we're gonna lose Lundberg. And it's
Yeah.
probably not gonna pass, no.
He froze up.
the Kirk freeze. Yeah.
He froze.
But the
matter
fact
what,
that,
so if we just add to the fire, I
yeah.
Yeah.
If
Well,
it's not something that we are gung ho about or really like, I think you just need to be quiet.
Yeah,
just let it go
exactly.
and see what happens.
Let it. Yeah. But I feel kind of optimistic
Yeah.
with
Well,
Lundberg's past history and him being so supportive of full practice. And he even said it was, full practice or he was done. He wouldn't be our bill sponsor anymore.
yeah, the only thing that I'm wondering about is the fact that he hasn't apparently, I mean, I talked to Reeves' office. He hadn't talked to Reeves. He hadn't talked to Jack
Yeah, that's-
Johnson. So I don't know if, and when I talked to Reeves' assistant, she kind of laughed. She goes, well, he might have just gotten fed up with us and how slow we're being on it and just decided to kind of do his own thing.
Well,
And maybe that's the case. I don't know, but you would think he would at least want some buy-in from the other working group members before he advances something. So who knows? We'll see. As soon as I get language, I'll pass it to you guys, and then I'll need to start making those Senate meetings either in health or commerce, pretty quick. So
whatever we have to do, Garrett, you just let us know, and I can put everything I've got on my schedule. I can put whatever off, and we can.
Yeah, I can too.
Well, and keep in mind, Tuesday our criminalization bill is going to be up. So Tuesday could potentially be a very long day, having two different bills up that we really care about in two different committees.
Yeah.
So it's that time of year, and the next,
well, we'll
next
get
2 or 3 weeks will be crazy, and then it'll be on the
Mm-hmm.
downhill swing. But we just got to get through it. So I'll keep you guys posted. But that's what I know up till now.
Who's on Senate Health? Do you know?
Yeah, I got it right here. It's Rusty Crowe is the chairman.
Okay.
Farrell Hell, Shane Reeves, Joey Hensley, Ed Jackson, Becky Massey, Art Swan, Bo Watson, and Jeff Yarbrough.
We're dead in that. There's no way we've got a shot there.
Yeah, I don't.
Unless Lundberg's got some chits that he's able to cash in.
Well, if you guys,
I've never heard of most of those people.
Yeah,
we've never visited them.
No, so I don't know what their opinion is on it anyway, because like Kirk said, a lot of those I've never met with and spoken
with.
Well,
the ones I do know, they were not positive.
No.
Well, maybe that's something that I don't say anything about, trying to get this thing re-referred, and we just keep it in commerce and just see how it plays out. And that's
we have a better shot in commerce.
I think
and
we
after
do
commerce,
too.
it's going to go to health anyhow. I'm sure it would have to go there.
Yeah.
I think commerce is probably a good place to start.
Yeah, and you got to remember too, if this thing somehow makes it, through the Senate, what are we going to do about the House? Is there anything to be done? I mean, is it the House going to play ball? Is it something where they might want to try to take it up next session and not even deal with it this session? Who knows?
Honestly, that's my gut feeling. That's my gut feeling is we're going to get to see a little teaser this time, and it's going to be road to next session.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. But
yeah. Okay.
And then, so I don't know, is this 6:27 by my clock?
6:27.
I guess they're going to, people
we have
getting on here
4 people in the waiting room. So I sent a message, but I am trying to find Chloe and I'm not seeing her in here at all. I was trying to get her connected before we started.
That would be ideal.
Did you send her an email?
Yeah, several actually.
Oh. Well, she confirmed that the times would be okay.
Yeah, I did see that. And
yeah, she did.
I had sent the Outlook invite, and then I sent a reminder email to the group earlier today. And then I just sent out a reminder email to each of you and all the attendees at about 6 p.m. your time. Just, hey, we're getting ready to start in a half hour. But I'm not seeing Chloe.
Is she
would not come in under another name, would she?
No.
She's East Tennessee, right?
She's East Tennessee. Yeah, she's Knoxville.
I guess she could figure out that it's 7:30 her time and 6:30
yeah, 6:30
our time.
That was one of the things that we had to clarify, right, Laura? That
yes,
it was
we did.
Yes. So we went over that issue with her that no, it's 6:30. And I didn't say Central Time. I never think Central Time. I'm like, I think everybody lives on my time. They should.
Yeah, because when I sent out the information, she's like, wait, is this like,
yes.
I thought this was Eastern time. And so I clarified 6:30 and then 7:30. And then she did respond that that would be okay. So I
Yes.
felt like she got the information. And so I know she got the Outlook invite because that's what started the question of time. And then I did the 2 reminders today. So we got about 1 more minute. Do you want me to continue to hold for those in the waiting room and see if she joins?
I would hold them.
Okay, I did send them a message letting them know, thank you for
I
joining.
just-
We'll admit
yeah.
you in a few minutes. Okay.
Yeah, I would just hold them. Hopefully she'll get on in a minute. These Zooms, Kurt, have been I don't know if I'm a fan or not.
When they work, they're
I
wonderful.
guess it just seems like it's been
So the technology feels like it's working better tonight, switching from
Yeah.
webinar to Zoom or to a
Yes.
meeting.
Yeah, that goes for
and-
sure, yeah.
Yeah, and we've got seven out of 20 in the waiting room right now. Oh, there comes Chloe. I'm gonna admit her.
Yeah, bring her on and then we can be ready to roll.
do you think she wants to bring her share up first? Let me stop.
If you could test hers real quick and then.
Hey, Chloe.
Y'all, I'm sorry I'm getting on here like running on fumes. I've got a Chick-fil-A. I've had a late night at the office. I had another meeting that went late. I was like in the drive-through like a crazy person. So I'm eating some French fries. I'm doing my best.
Do you want to try? Do you have a PowerPoint
No, not
slide?
tonight.
No. Oh, good. Okay, good. So we don't have to worry about that. Love it. Well, I'm going to put these 2 or 3 little slides up.
Okay.
So I suppose we are ready to roll, Laura.
Muted. Thank you. I just wanted to make sure we were good to go.
Yep.
Like we said, Sarah's also helping us, so she's going to
Okay.
be spotlighting speakers as we go through here.
Okay.
So as it changes, she'll be working on that for us. So let me go ahead and get everyone admitted, and then we'll make sure that microphones are muted and such, so we're not getting a lot of extra noise. Okay.
I'll do that.
Marcia, we have everyone admitted, so you guys can begin whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Marcia Barnes. I'm Director of Government Affairs with the Tennessee Nurses Association. And I have the pleasure of being your moderator for this evening's session. Tonight is the last session designated by TNA to increase the knowledge of nurses about the legislature, healthcare topics, and the legislative process here in Tennessee prior to our Day on the Hill, which will be next Wednesday, March the 8th. Okay. Now I'm not advancing, but that's okay. That's okay. This event qualifies for 1 hour of continuing education credit. To those of you who are attending this live presentation, you will receive a survey link afterwards by way of email. So that will be able to allow you to get your certificate. The Tennessee Nurses Association is an approved provider of nursing professional development by the South Carolina Nurses Association, an accredited approver by the American Nurses Credentialing Centers Commission on Accreditation. Before we begin, though, there are a few housekeeping matters that I want to just go over briefly. Please keep your microphones on mute so we don't get a lot of background noise. So during the presentation, you can raise your hand if you want to ask a question, or if you prefer, you can place the question in the chat box and we will do our best to get to your question as soon as possible. To help keep us on track, we ask that each of you please keep your devices muted. There's my muted and videos off like you are asking questions. At this time, I'd like to introduce this evening's guest speaker, Chloe Akers, a Tennessee native and criminal defense attorney who will be discussing the current abortion law here in Tennessee and its impact on nursing practice and emergency medical treatment. She is a graduate of Cornell University and the University Tennessee College of Law, and she is a champion of liberty and tenacious supporter of equality. She believes that all Americans deserve access to medical care, and she will fight for as long as it takes to regain every person's inherent right to reproductive freedom and bodily autonomy. She is the founder of Standing Together Tennessee, which is an online legal resource center for issues related to Tennessee's abortion ban. She currently lives in Knoxville, Tennessee with her fiance and her 2 rescue dogs. So she's a good person. She rescues dogs. So Chloe, you can begin.
All right. Hello. As embarrassing as this is, I do live with my fiance and our 2 rescue dogs. And that also includes my fiance's 2 children. And I have a family and all sorts of requirements. And I barely made it home in time for this Zoom. And so I'm having some Chick-fil-A for dinner. So if you see me drinking out of this giant obnoxious Chick-fil-A cup, that's what's going on. So this is a really interesting time for me to be having, and for all of us really to be having this Zoom and this conversation, especially given that the next day on the Hill for nurses is, I believe Marcia said March 8th. And something happened today that was really unusual and really important to know before the Day on the Hill for nurses that I definitely want to talk about. So the first thing that I kind of want to get into, and sometimes I have a PowerPoint for these presentations and sometimes I don't. It kind of depends on the vibe and what everybody's interested in. And I felt like tonight, the most appropriate way to go about this was, especially because it's designed to be question and answer format, is to really just give you all a brief understanding of what our law currently says, and how that impacts nurses in particular, and kind of move forward from questions there, and also talk about what's been happening in the legislature this session that's super relevant to nurses, to this law, to healthcare providers in general. So the first thing I think that it's important to understand is what our law does, what it says, and how it functions. Our law in Tennessee is actually profoundly straightforward in certain circumstances, and it's also profoundly complicated in others. Sorry, so my screen is, I'm going to remove the spotlight because it's I'm looking like just at myself, and it's like a lot of just me. Okay. That's all I can see right now. I'm not sure why. Hold on a second. Okay, well, here I am. I'm just talking to myself. Oh, there we go. Okay, now I have everybody else. This makes me feel better. Like I'm not just speaking to the void. Okay, so the first thing to understand is that Tennessee's law on abortion criminalizes the termination of any pregnancy for any reason. Okay. And it's really critical that folks understand the definitions of pregnancy and the definitions of abortion to fundamentally grasp what the law actually means in a really practical way. So the definition of pregnancy is the human female condition of having an embryo in her body from the moment of fertilization. And the termination of any pregnancy in the state of Tennessee is criminalized. And when you look at the definitions of abortion and pregnancy, you realize that this includes termination of ectopics with an injection of methotrexate. This includes terminations in cases of lethal fetal anomaly. There are absolutely no exceptions for rape, for incest, for any life or health of the patient, right? So if a provider is terminating a pregnancy in the state of Tennessee, he or she at this very moment is engaging in conduct that subjects them to the risk of potential prosecution for a Class C felony. Tennessee's abortion ban undeniably criminalized healthcare. And what struck me about this law when I first read it, kind of 8 months ago, I didn't really get upset about this law or angry about this law from a personal perspective. Like most healthcare providers, when someone comes into the hospital, when someone comes into the emergency room, when someone comes into your clinic, you look at the patient and you evaluate what is going on, what are the symptoms, how can I treat the problem? You're not so much interested in, do I like this patient? Is this someone I want to be friends with? Will that dictate how I treat them? I think about laws in a similar way, right? Whether I like the law or don't is really irrelevant. I tend to think about what does the law say and how does it function in practice? And so the reality of our law in Tennessee is that it completely criminalizes a medical procedure. And when you kind of pull up a little bit out of the politicized discussion around abortion, and you consider that this law made it a crime to perform a healthcare procedure, it becomes a little bit easier to understand why this is just so devastating to our healthcare system, right? If we made appendectomies a crime, or we made open heart surgery a crime, and there were no exceptions every time you engaged in this, healthcare procedure, you were risking criminalization, you were risking prosecution. You can understand from the perspective of a patient and a physician and a nurse and anyone else in the room why this would be incredibly concerning. So effectively, that is what our law says. In that sense, it's very simple. The termination of any pregnancy for any reason in the state of Tennessee is subject to prosecution as a Class C felony. We do not have any exceptions to our law. And this is really, really critical, I think, in part for nurses being on the Hill on March 8th and what's going on in our current General Assembly. So every other state that currently has a ban on abortion has an exception at the bare minimum for the life of the pregnant patient. And that includes Texas, that includes Alabama, Louisiana, Oklahoma. Every other state, and there's 13 that ban abortion, has an exception under its law for situations where termination is necessary to save the life of the patient. Tennessee is the only state in the country that's currently enforcing a total ban without any exception for medical emergency. Idaho was another state that had a law similar to Tennessee's, and it was partially enjoined on that basis. So for everybody practicing medicine in the state of Tennessee, there's just no denying it. You are truly and completely and 100% in the belly of the beast, okay? We are the worst and strictest law when it comes to criminalizing healthcare in the, as it pertains to reproductive rights and abortion management. So it's really critical that everybody understand that first and foremost. We are an outlier, okay? And so what's the difference between an exception and an affirmative defense? This has kind of been the hill that I chose to die on for the first, 6 months after Dobbs, was trying to explain to people that they are not the same thing. And as it turned out, it wasn't just me who felt that they were not the same thing. The United States Department of Justice under Merrick Garland sued the state of Idaho, essentially on this basis, saying that Idaho's law, which was similar to Tennessee's, did not have any exceptions for medical necessity, only an affirmative defense, and those two things were different. And the position of the DOJ, which was my position and remains my position, and was also reinforced by a federal district judge, is an exception is a situation where, under certain circumstances, conduct that would otherwise be considered criminal is determined not to be criminal because it's engaged in a specific way. An affirmative defense means the conduct is always criminal, but we're going to give you an opportunity to defend yourself after you've been arrested, after you've posted bond, once you've hired an expensive lawyer, and while you're at trial. Okay. So an exception carves out circumstances under which the conduct is just not a crime. An affirmative defense means the conduct is always a crime, but there's a mechanism to defend yourself if you're actually charged with committing the crime. Those are two really different things, and their difference is particularly pronounced when you are a criminal defense lawyer like myself, right? I understand, and I understood instantly and reading the trigger ban, that this was incredibly broad. There were absolutely no exceptions. There was only an affirmative defense. And within seconds of reading it, I thought this is going to crumble our healthcare system, right? Like, this is subjecting any healthcare provider to the risk of potential criminal prosecution. And what's really interesting and relevant for nurses is something called criminal responsibility. So when the Dobbs decision returned the issue of abortion to the states, it effectively said to the states, you can regulate abortion however you see fit. And Tennessee saw fit to make abortion criminal across the board. Tennessee, when you create a law that criminalizes conduct, that law is not just in isolation, right? It functions in the scope of all of the other laws on the books. So we have a statutorily recognized mechanism for culpability called criminal responsibility. That's a lot of legal words. Sorry, take a sip of this water. Criminal responsibility effectively means the following. In the context of sort of your traditional criminal legal example, criminal responsibility is the way in which prosecutors go after the getaway driver, right? And they say, look, a person drove a couple of their friends to a gas station. The two friends got out, went into the gas station, had the guns, held up the person behind the counter, got the money, and got back in the car. Despite the fact that the driver of the car never had a gun, never got out, never went into the gas station, the driver was sort of instrumental in completing the crime and is therefore held liable as though he or she was the actual principal, right? The actual person who went in to the gas station. This is the theory of criminal responsibility. It creates a mechanism to charge a person with the actual commission of the crime if their conduct is really integral to committing the crime. And what's so unique about criminal abortion is that truly there actually isn't a better example of potential criminal liability than nurses, especially when you're talking about termination in the context of surgical termination, where you have to have an anesthesiologist or a nurse anesthetist to complete that procedure. You have to have nurses in the operating room monitoring the patient and providing a level of assistance to the OBGYN or the MFM or whomever is performing the surgery, right? The surgery itself could not be accomplished but for the assistance of nurses. In that situation under Tennessee law, any nurse who provides assistance to a provider in terminating a pregnancy is equally as liable for the potential crime of criminal abortion as the provider, him or herself. And my sister's a nurse practitioner, and I've had a lot of conversations with her over the last few months about this. And something that I think is so interesting and so unique and specific to nurses is in many ways, doctors are caught between a rock and a hard place. They either perform a termination and do what's right to keep their patient alive while assuming the risk of potentially getting arrested, or they don't perform the termination and they violate their Hippocratic oath and potentially EMTALA and face malpractice, right? For nurses, it's a little different. There is an oath to sort of follow the lead of the physician, right? And this is something that I think the vast majority of Tennesseans who aren't in nursing don't necessarily understand, that it is the duty of the nurse to assist in providing the medicine as directed by the physician. And that puts nurses in an incredibly untenable position, because if you disagree with the judgment of the physician that a termination is or is not necessary, is really irrelevant. If you participate in that procedure, you are opening yourself up to the risk of criminal prosecution. And like doctors being stuck between a rock and a hard place, so too are nurses. There's no way out of this. And when people ask me, you know, how can I minimize my risk? The only way to take your risk of prosecution to zero is to never, under any circumstances, participate in a medical procedure that could even be considered a termination of pregnancy. That is the only way in Tennessee to reasonably ensure that you will not be prosecuted with a felony. And that's really unacceptable for so many doctors and so many nurses in all sorts of contexts, but especially with emergency medicine and OBGYN, right? And so it's not workable. The framework of this law does not account for the realities of medical decision-making. Everything is done on a spectrum. There's multiple people in the room, all of whom are making decisions, all of whom have different competing interests. But the one thing that keeps everybody going is doing what's right for the patient, what's in their best interest and their expressed interest. And I think what's so interesting is probably not the right word. What is so profoundly misguided about Tennessee's law banning abortion, which has nothing to do with your personal, political, or religious views on abortion, is that when you criminalize a healthcare procedure in this way, you create a dynamic where a healthcare provider has to weigh the decision-making for what's best for their patient against their own liberty interest. Okay, they have to decide, is the juice worth the squeeze? That's a phrase we use all the time in criminal defense, right? Like, is the juice worth the squeeze? Is it worth it to engage in X knowing that Y could happen? The context of abortion is the only medical procedure in which this evaluation takes place. In part because we never want this evaluation to take place. Medical professionals under no circumstances should ever be forced to ask themselves, should I do my job and risk going to prison? Or should I not do my job and risk this patient dying? Which, as I've learned over the course of the last 8 months talking to OBGYNs across the country, is absolutely the calculation, particularly when you're talking about complications from pregnancy, which can sort of turn on a dime, which can go from manageable but not good to deadly and out of control in a really short window. And so that's what we're dealing with in Tennessee. And this doesn't even touch the surface of, this barely touches the surface of all of the issues underlying the medical necessity component of abortion care. And I think this brings me to why it's so interesting that we're having this Zoom tonight, and where we are with the legislature and what's happening this session. So I spent most of the summer explaining to Tennesseans publicly, in the media, on Instagram, on any platform I could find, that we had no exceptions to our law on abortion, that there was no mechanism to decriminalize this procedure in cases of rape, in cases of incest, in cases of medical necessity. I knew this. I knew this just as I know the sun will rise in the east, right? I knew this because I read the law and I understood it. And our legislature and legislators individually were really pushing back against this. And they were like, no, there's an exception to save the life of the mother. And it went back and forth until eventually these legislators who passed this bill kind of saw the light and realized that I was right? And they have now agreed there's no exception. Okay. Some of them have come out publicly and said things like, we didn't really read the law, we didn't really know what it meant, excuse after excuse, blah, blah, blah. But the bottom line is we don't have an exception. And so right now, in this 2023 General Assembly session, there are bills going through the legislature to provide an exception for medical necessity. Now, it's interesting to me that so many of the, the legislators who, contended that there was an exception are now in rooms where they're talking about passing a bill for an exception. But be that as it may, today was a day that at 3:00 Central, 4:00 Eastern, the Senate Judiciary Committee was scheduled to hear testimony and vote on a bill introduced to create a medical necessity exception for abortion. And a lot of people, many stakeholders involved in this legislation were waiting with bated breath to see what was going to happen. And they postponed hearing this bill until March 14th, which creates a very interesting scenario for anyone who's going to be on the Hill on March 8th. I think it's really critical to understand that an exception to the abortion ban is not a real solution. I think that needs to be talked about, okay? Because even if we create an exception, we're just putting ourselves in line with every other state that bans abortion, including Texas, where we have seen the devastating delays in care that come from an exception as well. An exception and an affirmative defense, either way, it doesn't solve the ultimate issue of pitting the doctor's liberty interest against the care for his or her patient, okay? The only way that you take that equation out of healthcare is to legalize abortion up to the point of viability and reasonably regulate it thereafter. There's no way that you can create enough exceptions to account for the medical realities in a way that's workable. It's just impossible. And so when you're up on the Hill and you're talking to legislators and stakeholders in this, I think it's really critical to explain your fear and the way that this legislation is impacting your ability to do your job, and to think critically about your patients without evaluating your own self-interest, because quite frankly, we would never stand for that in any other context in healthcare. I can't imagine a world in which we criminalize treatment for cancer and forced our providers to decide whether a patient should get chemo or not in terms of whether it's likely that they're going to go to prison. I mean, it's so antithetical to everything we hold dear about our healthcare system in this country, which is the focus on patients and on care and on providing compassionate standard of care. And so I think that to the extent anyone on this Zoom is going to have an opportunity to speak to legislators in between now and the time that the exception bill is up for debate on the 14th, it's really important. What I can't do is I can't tell the legislators your personal stories, and I can't speak to what it feels like to be a healthcare provider in this environment and the risk that you take on and how devastating that is, not just to you, but to your patients. Because ultimately most legislators, many of them have daughters, they have granddaughters, they have wives, they have nieces, they have sisters, they have people capable of pregnancy in their lives who rely on excellent medical care. And this legislation precludes your ability to do your job. Plain and simple. And again, it really doesn't have that much to do with your personal view or your religious ideology or when does life begin or when doesn't life begin. I mean, at the end of the day, those are really personal decisions that I think merit a discussion outside of a state house. But I think when you're talking about moving forward in our state in a way that is healthy for providers and for their patients and a way that's workable, you really need to kind of pull up a little bit from the politicized atmosphere of abortion and try to hone in on what it means when we actually force doctors and nurses to weigh their liberty interest against their medical decision making. So that is in 30 minutes, 28 minutes, the sort of overarching view of our law. It criminalizes the termination of any pregnancy for any reason. It is equally applicable to doctors as it is to nurses or any provider who assists in the process. And it puts you as nurses in an incredibly challenging position, because ultimately you're very rarely making the final decision on the standard of treatment, but you're equally as culpable. And so that's a really challenging place to be. So I hope that that's given everybody a sense of kind of where we are at a baseline. And I wanted to leave enough time for questions, because I find that that's usually like the most helpful session. And also if you ask a question about like what you should do in a particular instance, I can't answer those because that would be direct legal representation, which I can't do. So I don't know if anyone has any questions.
Hi, Chloe. Julie Ham from TNA. Quick question. Hi. What kind of terminology do you think that we should use to better make these people understand the medical ramifications versus the political ramifications?
That's a great question. So I've given entire presentations about abortion without actually saying abortion. And usually I refer to the termination of pregnancy. Abortion is a word that has been politicized, and I hate to use the term, like kind of hijacked by special interests on both sides. Okay. This is not to say one or against the other. It's just, it's a medical term, but it's also a legal term, but it's also a political term. And sometimes when you say the word abortion, it's like saying death penalty. And I think that when you phrase this in terms of termination of pregnancy, it helps people understand what we're actually talking about, which is the evacuation of a uterus. If you want to go that far, I've also talked about it in those terms. Like, let's all just take a beat and realize what we're talking about here is evacuating a uterus, the termination of pregnancy, which is a medical procedure. And I think the more that you can focus your conversation on the fact that abortion is simply a medical procedure, it helps orient the folks that you're talking to a subject in a way that takes it out of the political arena. So I would really encourage you to use termination of pregnancy, evacuation of the uterus, and really try, as you're speaking about this issue, to constantly circle back to the medical sort of ins and outs of this procedure as healthcare, as opposed to sort of a politicized term of art, which makes it really difficult to communicate about this subject matter because it's so highly charged.
Perfect. Thank you.
I like that you use the terms medical necessity.
Mhm.
You know, we hear that all the time. So that's other terminology that probably could be a little more effective as well.
Definitely. And I think that, so one of the things I will tell you all that I'm working on, kind of behind the scenes, but it's coming more abundantly not behind the scenes, is a venture as a super PAC designed to completely disrupt the narrative around abortion. And part of why we're doing this is we're refocusing the conversation from the merits of banning an abortion to the cost of enforcing a law banning abortion. And by shifting the paradigm a bit, we create a world in which you're no longer having to discuss when life begins with someone or religion with someone, because at the end of the day, I can't compete with God. Okay, I can't compete with religious mandates. It just is what it is. Okay, and so when you find ways to have the conversation that don't involve an analysis of when life begins, chances are you're going to be better situated. And so I really find that talking about abortion in the context of medical necessity, which is ultimately what many of our healthcare providers are trying to manage, it sort of veers away from, getting into like when life begins, because once you've gotten to when life begins, it's very hard to kind of get out of that discussion. And so, as challenging as it may be when you're talking to lawmakers or stakeholders and you see the conversation veering in that direction, I think it can be really helpful to say, listen, I deeply respect your beliefs and your religious or political or ethical or moral understanding of this issue. But I want to try to redirect the conversation a bit to some of the practical is a good word, some of the practical applications that we see this come up in our everyday work as nurses and healthcare providers. So practical is also a great word. And continually try to orient yourself away from discussions about things like when life begins, because again, that's a really hard, that's just a difficult conversation to have, particularly when you're going up against a religious mandate. You won't win that ever. And that's kind of one of the things I've learned in this is if you could find ways to have conversations that don't implicate those types of evaluations, it's more productive.
Hey, Chloe, this is Garrett Johnson. Really appreciate your time tonight and thought your overview was very insightful. So thank you for that. I would love to hear your thoughts and your legal perspective on the implications of this legislation if it does not pass and we remain status quo in the state. What kind of long-term effects do you foresee that potentially having? Because I do think that it's important that when we're talking to legislators, they understand what the implications are for not passing this bill.
That's a great question. I will tell you all, not to get your hopes up, I highly doubt this is going to pass. Most of us in sort of the know in this arena are aware that the medical necessity exception bill was killed by a special interest group a couple of weeks ago. The likelihood of a medical necessity exception bill passing this session is slim to none. The rape and incest exception bill is dead in the water right now. That's not happening. I think the implications of our legislature not even being able to advance a bill to create exception for medical necessity is very dangerous to the continued sustainability of our healthcare system. It shows doctors and nurses how they're valued by our state, which is you're not. It creates an atmosphere where physicians, nurses, anyone in the healthcare industry is much, much more likely to leave the state. And I think that that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? By not passing an exception this session out of the gate, okay? If people are not asking for the world here. Healthcare providers are simply saying, hey, we need to have some workable model to be able to do our jobs and without fear of prosecution. And if our legislature can't get its act together to bring itself in line with Texas, I think that it sends the wrong message to hospitals, doctors, nurses, and everyone in the industry, which is we value our endorsements and our candidacy support from special interests more than we value you. And that will result in more healthcare providers leaving. And we already have a crisis in this state of hospitals closing, of healthcare deserts. We have a lack of OBGYNs in our rural communities. And this is going to further frustrate a problem that we are already seeing perpetuate. And so I think when you talk to lawmakers, explaining that to them, and sort of being very upfront, none of you all are indentured servants. You can leave at any moment. And of course, that's easier said than done, right? And we have families, we have responsibilities, we have careers, but I do think there becomes a tipping point where even if you don't leave the state, you begin to practice in a different area. And that's really a shame, especially because the United States has one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the world. And Tennessee has one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the country. And so criminalizing physicians and failing to account for the need for an exception just furthers that. And that's a really big problem. And it's something I've talked about for a while from the beginning, which is I don't know what we're going to do with, I mean, if we don't have highly qualified OBGYNs, nurses, nurse practitioners to deliver babies, where does that leave us? And so I think that's a really important thing to remind lawmakers about if they don't pass these exceptions, is the message that sends to the invaluable resource that is healthcare providers. On the heels of, might I add, the worst couple of years to be a healthcare provider in this country. As I said, my sister is a nurse practitioner. My stepdad, before he passed away, was an anesthesiologist. And I think about what doctors and nurses have been through over the last few years in this state and in this country, and literally putting their lives on the line to keep people safe and alive. And now our legislature has decided to throw another shrimp on the Barbie to make it even harder to do your work. And we are up against burnout and rage and a desire to leave that it's unacceptable. And it's really, really dangerous for our entire social and economic stability to burn down our healthcare system over a special interest that really most Tennesseans aren't interested in even seeing through to the end, right? Like Vanderbilt just did a poll, 82% of Republicans polled supported abortion access up to 15 weeks. So this total abortion ban is not consistent with what the majority of Tennesseans want. And the cost of continuing to persist in this is going to be our healthcare providers leaving, and our healthcare providers changing practices. And that results in a devastating situation for patients and their families. And so I think that's one thing that providers can really explain in a very real way, that one of the consequence of not passing an exception is the message that it sends to our healthcare community. And again, on the heels of, I think, sending a wrong message for a couple of years to begin with. And I mean, I know from speaking to not only my sister, my family, but the colleagues and the friends that I have in the healthcare industry and in this world, you all are people who chose to take a career and a job that is many times thankless, especially for nurses. This is such a challenging, it's challenging work because you're connecting with the patients and you are the humanity in the room. And I think that requires you to give a little bit of yourself every day in a way that's really remarkable. And I think our legislature should be championing you. I think that they should be providing every single opportunity to build you up and lift you up, instead of, promoting, I'm just going to say it, like bullshit legislation that puts you all at risk of getting arrested. I think you deserve better. I know you deserve better. And I think it's really critical that when you go in and speak to lawmakers, you have that in the back of your minds, that especially you as nurses, you are the people that keep us all human in this process. And you hold the hands and you talk to the families and you provide a level of care that we would all be worse off if we didn't have. And so really, really hitting that with the lawmakers, I think is critical, because it's the one unifying thing for all of us. We're all going to die. We're all going to get sick. We're all going to need care at some point or another. And that's you guys, and you deserve more. So I think reminding them of that is helpful. I should have recorded that maybe, and you guys can play it on a loudspeaker. I don't know. Okay, I got a question. Are there any legislators that are sensitive to make this change and need complimenting? Yes and no. This is a political question. most lawmakers are terrified to step outside of what is approved by Tennessee Right to Life, because this is a special interest group that it wields an enormous amount of power and control, as we saw, recently in the House subcommittee on health, right? We saw a lead lobbyist for Tennessee Right to Life just openly threaten the lawmakers with political consequences if they voted in favor of the exception. And so while there are certainly lawmakers who I think privately are very keen to make changes, I don't know publicly if they're willing to do so at this time, because it is still considered by them to be politically dangerous. I think part of my mission and part of the role of my venture in the super PAC and what we're working on is to change that paradigm, to make it more dangerous to not change the law. But that's a political battle and conversation. So I wish there were some more that were sensitive to make this change, and I do believe there's quite a few of them privately, but publicly, I think it's very few, and it's why none of us expect the health of the mother, as it's referred to, but the medical necessity exception, I don't think it's even going to get through the Senate Judiciary, let alone to the floor of the House and the Senate. And that's just fear of our lawmakers that's instilled through special interests. So I don't know if there's any other questions. I have a few more minutes. I know this is very politically, I don't know, we've gotten in, like, getting into the details here, but I guess if no one has any other questions, I'll wait to see if Marcia has anything else to say. But yeah, I mean, that's my take. I think you need to fight really, really hard for yourselves, for your profession, and for your ability to do your job before any legislator that you meet, and in every single conversation you have with anyone in your life who doesn't really quite understand this issue. Do not be afraid to talk about it. It is scary. It's overwhelming. It's not always fun dinner conversation, but it's really, really important. And I think the vast majority of Tennesseans, most people, when they understand what this is all about, want to support doctors and they want to support nurses. You just have to help get them there. And that can come directly from you all, and much better from you than from me.
Chloe, that was a great analogy, I guess, when you said this was the only medical procedure that, you could be criminalized or be charged for performing. Putting it in the perspective of, an appendectomy and, open heart, or someone with appendicitis and the appendix ruptures, and you get, they can get, septic, and they can die as well. So, that really resonated with me when you compare it with all the numerous other medically necessary procedures that we do. It puts it in the perspective that this is, loss of life if something's not done.
Yeah, and we trust our healthcare professionals to make really complicated decisions all the time, right? Like, I think about organ donation. I think about making choices regarding who gets the kidney, who gets the heart, who gets the corneas. I think about all of the ethical dilemmas that we trust our healthcare providers to navigate, because they're trained and because we know that they are the best at it, not a legislator who went to real estate school. Okay. And yes. So I don't think this is all that different from such a situation. And I think it's really helpful to, the other thing that I think can be somewhat helpful, maybe not in discussing this with your legislator, but I think in discussing this with family members, and I found a lot of success in this analogy, which is I was raised in a very faith-based family. Went to Lutheran elementary school. I'm from Knoxville. I'm from East Tennessee. Like this was the community and the value system that I was brought up in. And what concerns me to some degree about some of this decision making is I recognize that there are other areas where certain faiths reject antibiotics, for example, where it goes against a particular faith-based, religious demand, dictate to take antibiotics. And we have all of these really, from my perspective, interesting cases in the United States Supreme Court and state court about when a practice of a religious tenet becomes, dangerous. When are you allowed to? When are you not? Like if your religion and your religious and your faith dictates that you use certain psychedelic drugs or that you don't take antibiotics, right? We recognize in this country that these are like profoundly personal choices and that they're valid, and that having faith is something that we value in Tennessee in particular, in East Tennessee in particular, in this country. But we also recognize that there is a danger to sometimes allowing that faith-based decision-making to govern larger systemic choices. And I think when people start to consider what it would look like if the legislature began to do things like say when we could have antibiotics and when we couldn't, when we were appropriate candidates for a liver transplant and when we weren't, whether we treated certain STDs and when we didn't, when we would care for someone with a drug overdose and when we wouldn't. Like all of a sudden you start to understand a bit more about how dangerous this sort of principle is of getting into healthcare from a place of ethics and morality and religion. It's not just religion. It's sort of this confluence of things and decision making. And I just think that this is an area of our society where the professionals, the people who've gone to school and understand what they're doing should really be in charge. And of course, there's always going to be outlying issues here and there. But I find that it does really cause people to take a beat when I explain that there are certain religions for whom antibiotics is a non-negotiable. You don't take it. And that's okay. And that's respectable. But that's absolutely not going to be forced upon an entire group of people or an entire state or an entire population, and really sort of thinking things through just completely outside the context of abortion. I find that that's a helpful exercise, maybe not with the legislature, but in your own communities and in your own families and your groups of friends, depending on, how you know these people. It's not denigrating religion at all, or saying, oh, I hate when I hear, so this is just an aside, but I went to college in New York. I used to live in Philly and Seattle, and I have a lot of friends all over the country. And sometimes they say the most like asinine things about my community and about Tennessee. And it really makes me angry because when they say things like, religious people are so crazy. No, they're not. I'm a religious person. Like this is something, like faith is something to be valued, and it's really hard to find and it's really hard to keep. And I think there's opportunities and ways to have these conversations without denigrating someone's faith and someone's religion, but talking about honestly some of the pitfalls and things that we can run into if we stop asking questions, I suppose is really the best way to describe it. And I think I don't know, it really gets under my skin when people from elsewhere in the country try to make Tennesseans out to be these sort of backwards people, which I think it's absolutely the opposite. And I think people of faith are really, I admire so much because again, I don't have enough of it. But I think we do need to be able to have conversations and ask questions and be honest with one another. And I think everyone probably on this Zoom call, and you're navigating complex issues every day in your professional life. I think we're capable of doing it in our personal lives. And I think it's what makes Tennesseans particularly unique is our capacity to like listen to one another and understand and have empathy and compassion, and hear both sides of an issue, but explain the dangers and some of the things that people may not have thought about. And so that's sort of another way to think about this in your personal life. Again, this may not be like, you may not want to go toe to toe with like your legislator over this issue, but I do think it's an opportunity to have a discussion in your family and in your friends and in that sort of inner circle, to the extent you feel comfortable. I have no idea how many nurses have signed up for the Day on the Hill. I'm imagining Marcia might know that.
I think nurses probably around 50. Students about 160, 170. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, that's a great number. You know how many?
I hope you are one of those.
0. You know, it's not lost on me that the Tennessee Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, to my knowledge, has not even
really
suggested a Day on the Hill. Yeah.
Well, maybe you need to rally the troops.
Listen, I'm rallying all of the troops that I can. I'm not even taking criminal cases anymore at this point in my career, but I think I will say this, I know we only have 5 minutes to like end on this topic. People have asked me every day, you know, do you receive threats? You must be so afraid to talk about this and be in this space publicly. And I will tell you all the God's honest truth. I haven't received, you can look at my Instagram. I rarely read the comments because it's like too intense, but I have not had any horrible threats. I haven't had any horrible comments. I have not had, I haven't faced the backlash that a lot of folks, myself included, thought I would. And I fundamentally believe in my soul that it really is just bearing out what the polling has shown, that Americans, Tennesseans, Knoxvillians, Nashvillians, we've moved on. Okay. This is not the scary, overwhelming, politically insane issue that it was in like 1996. Okay. I really, I go out, I see people all the time in downtown Knoxville. I've never had anyone like say anything horrible to me. In fact, almost every time I go to a restaurant, I go to a bar, I do anything, usually someone will come up and say, you know, I really respect what you're doing, or thank you for myself, for my daughters, my granddaughters. And so I think to the extent that anyone's feeling fear, I hope that I can express, at least from my perspective, I've been I have not encountered any like incredibly negative, like horrific vitriol from the other side. I think mostly because most people are somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. Did you see this question? Does the moral argument remind you of the argument surrounding HIV/AIDS in the 80s?
Yeah. So
absolutely.
Okay. Ray, listen, I don't know where Ray is on this. Okay. So believe it or not, when I was in high school, I went to high school in South Florida. I had to do volunteer work to get my diploma because I was in this like special nerdy program. Anywho, I volunteered at an HIV/AIDS clinic, and this was in 1998, 1999. And something that's so interesting to me about the HIV/AIDS movement, and I think about, so in all social movements, there's usually like a few leaders and they never agree on the best way to advance the movement, right? You see this as far back as the civil rights movement, right? You had Martin Luther King Jr., you had Malcolm X, you had the Black Panther movement, you had all of these different organizations that all felt like there was a different way to achieve the goal. And I think about HIV/AIDS, and the thing that strikes me, and it hurts me deeply to say this out loud, but funding for HIV and AIDS became a priority when straight people started dying of HIV and AIDS. And I think about Ryan White, and I think about people who acquired HIV AIDS through blood transfusions. I think about when straight people started talking about their experience, that all of a sudden this issue mattered to everybody else. And there's a part of that that is undeniably American, right? Like, things don't usually matter to us in this society until they matter to us personally. And it's one of the reasons why I think healthcare providers have such a unique role to play in this entire conversation, because you all have the capacity to make this matter to people in a way that's personal. And yeah, I think that PrEP is going to be this first drug that goes in this state. If we don't roll back this issue where we say, okay, well, we've banned abortion, which effectively means we've closed the market to mifepristone, we're going to close the market to PrEP. We're going to close the market to PrEP because, you know, we don't like PrEP. We don't like that, what PrEP is, what it stands for. You know, I mean, I'm watching our legislature advance these really antiquated policies attacking the LGBTQ community just as it stands. And so, yeah, I think there is a lot of similarity between the HIV/AIDS crisis, between healthcare and morality and religion, and who deserves to live and who deserves to die. And it is really disheartening to think about it in that way. It's a cruel truth that I think about. And I think about HIV and AIDS, and I think about the generations of brilliant, largely gay men that were wiped out of our society because our government didn't want to acknowledge their existence and didn't want to fund a cure until straight people started getting sick. And that is messed up. But that hasn't changed. That hasn't changed from 1990 to 2023. You've got to make these issues matter to people in ways that affect them, because the vast majority of people simply don't care unless it matters to their personal lives. And I think that's the goal, right, of every social movement historically, is how do we make white Americans care about what's happening to Black Americans in the South? How do we make straight people care about this disease that's affecting what they think is the gay community? How do we make, you know, people who are bigoted care about the rights of the LGBTQ community in terms of marriage and children? Like, the answer traditionally is you make it matter to them because you connect that to their own well-being. But yeah, I see a lot of parallels, as much as I hate to admit it. And I really wish that we had come farther from that place. I think it's really hard to think about and really sad, but it is my experience as a high school intern, or like volunteer at the HIV/AIDS clinic, made me want to be a lawyer, because I got on the phone with the manager from a Chinese restaurant in our local food court who fired one of our patients for his HIV status. And I just spouted off some like stuff about the law that I didn't really know. And they rehired our client and that patient. And it made me in that moment be like, okay, this is my calling. So that's a side note, but that's a community and a group of people I feel very close to from many, many years ago in my own youth, my own childhood. So it's a good question, and makes me think about a lot of great people and a lot of great people who've passed away since that time because of ignorance.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Oh, I just saw the one with the right to die. I will tell you all this.
Huh.
If you get into a conversation about like medically assisted suicide, that's when I would probably just be like, you know what? We need to redirect, because that's a very, very challenging subject matter. And even as an attorney, that's a really complicated issue. And I think if you're talking about right to die and physician-assisted suicide, and even in the context of abortion, chances are that conversation's gone off the rails. So I think you need to try to redirect it back to, you know, from your perspective in terms of medical necessity. This is a medical procedure, and in the context of medical necessity, the fetuses and the embryos that require termination are never going to be viable in the first place. So I think that that's always a very helpful, well, most likely aren't going to be viable. You know, when you think about lethal anomalies, ectopic pregnancies, premature rupture of membranes, things like that. So I would steer clear of any analogies with physician-assisted suicide, because I found myself at a few dinner parties, like 3 glasses of wine in, where that one comes up, and it never ends well. It usually ends with me being like, I'm leaving. So I would be careful about that.
Good advice.
Yes. And also, I think this last thing I'll say, just reminding these people in the legislature, like, of what was just said in the comments, that you guys are, nurses in particular, are just your healthcare providers, and you are historically and systemically like the tie that binds medicine and compassion. And you're the, like, in my personal opinion, and it's not just because my sister's an MP, but like, you're the most important people in the room, because as somebody who's had to have my own, like all of us, right? Like I've had health issues, and we've all been alone, and we've all been scared. And it's always been a nurse that's, generally speaking, made us feel human, and made us feel okay. And I just think there's such a special place in our society for the work that you all do. And our government owes you more. Like, we all owe you a debt of gratitude after COVID. But if nothing else, like if you're on the day on the hill and you get nervous and you get like you don't know what to say or something, I think the easiest thing you can do is just talk about experiences you've had with your patients, where you've been there when someone has had the best news, and you've been there when someone's had the worst news, and you're often the people in the room when it's at the end. And like, I don't know, I think it's worth reminding these people who have never set foot in a hospital room, who have no idea what kind of like metal on metal that is, to put yourself in that kind of a situation, and to do so with compassion and empathy and love is just really a remarkable thing. And I think if you get in there and you just completely forget everything, and you're so intimidated and you're sweating, just start talking about your job and why you love it, and why you do it. And it's worth reminding these people. And we're all lucky to have you. So that's what I would say.
Okay. I guess that's all the time we have for questions. Chloe, this has been wonderful. Thank you for sharing your legal expertise with us. And thank you for appreciating what we do.
Well, you're welcome. I'm very appreciative of everything you all do so much. Really from the bottom of my heart. Nurses have been the change maker in my own life, in the lives of my family, my grandparents, my sister, my mother. You all mean the world to so many people in Tennessee, and I hope you know that, at least for me. And I have your back, and I think a lot of other advocates do as well. So if anybody has any questions, also please feel free. I'm going to just put my personal email in the chat box. And anybody who's going to the day on the hill, or you have questions or anything you want to talk through, I'm around. Thank you so much for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you. And TNAonline.org could register for Day on the Hill if you haven't done so already. Thank you again for joining us.
Bye, y'all. Thank you.
Thanks, Chloe.